Michael Roos. Michael Roos is again, mainstream atheist academic. He recently published a book, which was published by Oxford University, called Darwinism as Religion. And it's not like some ploy to sell the book. He actually meant it, Darwinism as Religion. And in this book, he makes a very powerful argument. He basically says, look, there's one aspect of Darwin's theory that's a valid scientific theory, right? No one's denying that, and he's not denying that. However, there is another aspect in which it is more than just a theory, it is an ideology, it is a secular religious religion. Secular religious perspective, that's what he calls it. And what he says is that's been the case from the very beginning, that this is a rival to traditional religion, and it is something that he is willing to admit, although very few in the field are. And if you pick up the 1980s book by Richard Dawkins, The Blind Watchmaker, you start to see why. Because clearly these guys are saying, look, it's more than just science. And what he says in The Blind Watchmaker is that Darwin allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists. So if there's a theory which you think is making you intellectually satisfied in being an atheist, you're automatically going to be biased towards that theory. And not only that, in terms of your metaphysics, in terms of your philosophy, because everyone has a philosophy, whether you believe philosophy is useless or not, you are going to import that in. Now, what's interesting about, if we get to the real live wire here, which is atheism being the foundation for the religion of evolutionary humanism, leading to the propaganda and leading to the miscommunication of the valid science and the perception of it, Darwin would have completely disagreed with that, because Darwin was never an intellectually satisfied atheist. And this is what's so interesting about, if you look at the new atheist movement and you look at their works and you look at their arguments, because Darwin would have disagreed fundamentally. If you pick up the most popular atheist book, The God Delusion, the central argument of the God Delusion is based on Darwin's theory of evolution. But Darwin himself said, in my wildest fluctuations, I was never an atheist. In fact, according to his biographers, it's very explicitly clear that he was a deist when he published The Origin of Species. He was a deist for the majority of his life after he discovered evolutionary theory. Near the end of his life, he became an agnostic, not because of his theory, but because of the problem of evil and suffering. And he was explicit that he found it absurd for someone to say that they couldn't subscribe to his theory and be a theist. A last word on Islam and Darwinian evolution, or no, not Darwinian evolution, because as a Muslim, or as Muslims, we don't have a problem with accepting Darwin's theory as a valid scientific theory. It's not an issue. The issue is when it's pushed as being literally true. Because you don't have to be Muslim to realize that the philosophy of science doesn't grant the status of scientific theories to be literally true. Second, we believe that the purpose of life is not dictated by the processes that may have been inferred for the way that evolution may work. So the way that Richard Dawkins explains in The Selfish Gene, that there is no higher rationale than survival and reproduction, right? And everything else that we're doing is a byproduct of that. So when we do things which, according to survival and reproduction, seem quite absurd, like being a monk and not getting married, or like, really intelligent people like Isaac Newton feeling proud that they died virgins, these types of things from an evolutionary perspective don't make any sense. However, they're seen as byproducts. But Islam has a completely different perspective, and the perspective is that human beings aren't just a material substance brought about by a blind mechanical process, but we have a higher goal in life, and we have a higher purpose, and that is to worship the Creator that created everything. And we do not believe that there is that life can be reduced to purely a mechanical, material process, and that very thing defines who we are. So as human beings, if we're to look at, there's nothing that moves human beings more than morals, say, right? So if I was to describe to you a physics equation, none of you will get excited. But if I describe to you something else as a fact of nature, you won't get excited. However, if I describe to you a situation of a starving child and somebody walking past them who refuses to help, or a situation where somebody walks into a burning house and saves people, that is something which moves people. However, from a materialistic point of view, morality can just be broken down essentially to a byproduct of, say, kin selection, reciprocal altruism, or something else, which itself is broken down to selfish genes. And we all know, or I hope we all agree, that that is not sufficient to explain the human experience. Everything good I have said is from God, every mistake is my own. I look forward to your questions. Okay, you can raise your hand or you can talk. I'm easy either way. Yes?
Am I right in saying that Muslims believe that Allah was omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient? And if so, why would He create creatures which are not fully evolved? So it's clear that evolution has happened, and why would Allah not create the most evolved form of a human and create anything less than that? And secondly, I think I'm right in saying that Muslims believe that humans come from Allah created a man and woman, and from that all humans come, essentially. So who existed before that? Like, we know evolution is a thing. So before those, that man and woman that Allah created, what was before that?
Okay. So firstly, your first question was about why would Allah make something which is less than evolved? And what I would say is that, going back to this slide, the idea of highly evolved, lesser evolved, and again it presupposes that progression view is actually incorrect. So for the assumption that something is evolving towards a goal, so therefore it's lesser evolved or more evolved, that assumes there's a goal of evolution. But that idea that there is a goal that we're headed towards is actually not correct. That's not the way that actually works. So that's the first point. The second point was about what was before. Now, the thing is that when it comes to the creation of man, or the creation of the universe, or the creation of these types of things, God says in the Quran, I didn't make you witnesses to your creation or to the creation of the heavens and the earth. So we can say very little about the creation and how everything began. We, as Muslims, we don't say, for example, you have some, and this is a very small minority of Christians, it's not all of them, it's a minority up in, across the pond, right? And they're the ones who would say things like, look, human beings and dinosaurs, they existed at the same time, or this species, or no two species can have a common ancestry, whatever. So as Muslims, we have a lot of unknowns in terms of creation. So we wouldn't make statements like, okay, human beings and dinosaurs could not exist at the same time, or this thing or that thing can definitely not have a common ancestor, all the rest. What we do say is that, on the minimum, all human beings alive today have a common ancestor which goes back to an ancestral couple. And therefore all human beings are part of one species, although there's 27 different ways of defining species, but they're part of one family, right? Now, before human beings, there may have been other things which existed. That's a possibility Islamic. It doesn't contradict Islam. So they could have been like Homo naledi, something like that, or Homo erectus, or Denisovans, or whatever. So there's a lot of unclarity. It's not clear. We as Muslims can't say, okay, this is what definitely happened. There are things we can be clear about. For example, all human beings today coming back to an ancestral couple. But other than that, a lot of other things, we can't make those sweeping general statements. It's actually quite difficult to do that. And when people do that, when you ask them for evidence, it's quite difficult for them to provide that evidence. And what we realize is they just basically made an inference most of the time. Yes.
Just a question regarding the picture on the screen. Perhaps a lot of people have this question, but we know that Darwinian evolution, as you said, the mechanism was natural selection. So it's more of a survival of the fittest. If you've got the best genes, then pass them on to the next generation, and the ones who fail to possess these ones die out. So that creates, it's like capitalism. But my question is as follows: is that what does Darwinian evolution or evolution in general say to, for example, the three in the middle? Because now there are monkeys and there are humans. But why is it that there are monkeys and not these ones in the middle? If these progressing creatures are supposed to be better than the prior generation.
So look, again we go back to the question of progression. Yeah, better. This is a big discussion in the biological community, and there's a big misconception about, okay, there is one sense in which, okay, things exist today, so they must be better in some sense to the things that don't exist. But this thing about, okay, so clearly the one human-like creature at the end that's more evolved than the others, and some people have said things like, well, if human beings evolved from monkeys, then why do monkeys exist? But that would be a misunderstanding, because the theory doesn't say human beings evolved from monkeys. It says human beings and chimpanzees and other primates, going back, they have a common ancestor. And the supposed split, which is some 6-7 million years ago, in between that and now, if you imagine, we would need millions of transitional fossils, right? But fossilization is very rare. It's like lightning hitting an area. So getting into this sort of discussion, you automatically start to unravel some of the assumptions which are made, which assumptions are based upon the public understanding of Darwin's theory. What I like to focus on more is why are we even discussing this, and why, for example, aren't like 50 people or 100 people here coming over and listening to a talk about string theory and atheism, right? Why are we speaking about Darwin's theory and atheism? So the crux of the issue is not even these biological nuances or these discussions about progression and fossils and all the rest. The crux of the issue is really about the existence of God and whether this theory disproves God. Everything else is, if you like, the side dish. And I think that's how I would summarize what I'm trying to convey. Yes.
So in terms of the nature of science, we know that it has to heavily rely on induction. From your own study of this field, would it be fair to say that Darwinism is the best explanation within science for human existence, or are there other evolutionary theories that have a greater weight?
Okay, that's a good question. So the first point is that science, apart from the thing which I've discussed, is, and actually I did mention it briefly, it was methodological naturalism is also part of that. So based on methodological naturalism, if we were to infer theories and were to look at theories in the context of science, what we need to understand is that science functions, although it's not meant to, more like a democratic system. So if you're to ask who is the Prime Minister of the UK, you'd say Theresa May. You wouldn't say who is best suited to be the Prime Minister of the UK. I'm not saying she's not. Just saying that's just the truth, the fact that she is the Prime Minister of the UK. Likewise, in science, if someone says, what is the best theory? I mean, there's many different ways you can cut the onion, but I would just say the best theory in any field is what's the most popular, because that's just the way that science works, right? So from that definition, we would say Darwinism. Darwinism is the prevalent idea, the prevalent paradigm, and what I'm trying to convey is prevalent paradigms don't translate to truth, regardless whether they're evolutionary biology or something else. Because I think some Muslims have difficulty in even accepting Darwin's theory as being science. And I think that's just not rational, because you can't defend that. And there isn't a need to make that argument, but I think it's just kind of like an overreaction, saying, and I've heard this before, where some people are like, look, let's not even accept it as a theory, and let's propose something like intelligent design, right, as a rival. Now, I've spoken out against intelligent design because I believe that methodological naturalism doesn't allow that. Fair enough. I mean, Scott Todd, he's an evolutionary biologist, and he summarizes it really well. He says, if all of the data points to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is not accepted in science because it's not naturalistic. And I agree with him. Because in science, you can only accept things according to the paradigm of methodological naturalism. Yes?
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for this talk. And I appreciate that the main critic, I understand, is the instrumentalization of Darwinism, of the theory, how it was instrumentalized politically for whatever reason. So what is your thought on theistic evolution?
Theistic evolution. Well, the thing is, theistic evolution means many different things, right? So there's one aspect of theistic evolution which Muslims wouldn't really have a problem with, or Christians, whatever, which is known before Darwin, that you do have branching out, you do have evolution taking place, you do have this. But if you mean theistic evolution in the sense that you have a cell, the first cell, which evolved into all life forms, and it happened via natural selection, but people explain it within a theistic paradigm. Asa Gray, who was a friend of Darwin, and they were contemporaries and they were exchanging letters and stuff, he was a biologist or whatever up in Harvard or one of these American universities, and Darwin was in the UK. He was a theistic evolutionist. So it's coherent, it makes sense as a system. Do I subscribe to that type of theistic evolution? I don't. But if someone was to, anything makes more sense for me than atheism. So yeah, I would say yeah, theistic evolution, if somebody was to subscribe to that, that would make more sense than the idea that you have atheistic evolution, if you want to call it that it's all mechanical and it's all blind. Because I do think when it comes to this topic, there's too much focus on human ancestry or ethics or this or that or social Darwinism, whatever. The crux of the issue is the existence of God, and whether this theory disproves the existence of God or it doesn't. I think that's the crux of the matter. And once we deal with that, everything else is, not that important. Yes?
What does Islam say about the age of the earth itself?
Yep.
Does that contradict Darwin's theory of evolution?
Okay, so that's a good question. And again, this is related to what somebody asked me. So some convert to Islam from Christianity a few months ago, 2 years ago in fact, he came up to me and looked really, really worried, and he said, we believe the earth is 6,000 years old, so how were the other things happening before this? And I explained to him, sorry bro, we don't believe that. Because he used to be a Christian and a certain type of Christian, he assumed that that's what Muslims believe. And that's not a belief that's held by all Christians. That's just a belief that's held by some Christians in North America. And so we as Muslims, we don't have a date. We don't have a time. We don't have 50,000 years, 100,000 years, 6,000 years. We don't have that. We don't have anything in our theology or our history which says this is the age of the earth, this is the age of man, this is when the earth is going to end. Because there's people working out the end of the earth, the end of the world, Armageddon, Malhama, whatever it is. They're working out the dates using like narrations of the Prophet and stuff. You can't do stuff like that. We don't have those things, right? And a lot of people make those inferences, and other people hear that and they think those inferences are what the scriptures say. But it's not. Those are inferences. There's another question somewhere here. Yeah, there, sorry.
Hi, thank you for the talk. First of all, does Islam have an explanation of Homo erectus and Homo neanderthals? I guess that's based on my question of yours. These individuals, fair enough, they may have died off, but they were, well, we know that Homo neanderthals had quite a rich culture, including art and stuff. Definitely my best. This is a very interest of mine. As well as the fact that if we come from the perspective that Allah created these species, did he just need something to practice on before he had Homo us, basically?
No, because look, we don't have a problem with Neanderthals or Denisovans or Homo naledi or Homo erectus. So again, the idea that look, all of life, all of the earth is only really for human beings, right? Anything else that may have come may have been some sort of prototype which wasn't really needed and then it died out. So we don't really have that. If there's things which existed before Homo sapiens, which could have been different to Homo sapiens or similar, and what we used to think about the Neanderthals was that they were like brutes and they were like ruffians, but now we've started to discover actually they have a rich culture, like you see, and they have loads of things going on. So axiomatically, we don't have a problem. I mean, they could have lived, they could have died out, whatever reason they existed, we don't know. We don't have a problem with any other, because there's, I'm not sure exactly, but there's something like 17 different types of potential human species which were different to Homo sapiens. So even if there wasn't 17, even if there's like 1,000 different types which existed at different periods and died out, we don't have a problem with that. And again, someone can ask another question to your question, which is, what is Islam's view on the idea that certain groups of people alive today share genetic data with Neanderthals, So, were they part of that family too? Again, these are not the sort of things where I can give you a clear-cut argument and say, okay, this is what Islam says. What I can say is that there are various possibilities, and none of those possibilities contradict the fundamental pillars of our worldview. I hope that makes sense, right? So I'm not making because sometimes when you have somebody speaking about this topic, they say, right, I'm going to draw the line here. This is when the first human came. This is what we consider to be a human. This is what we don't consider to be a human. And this is what we believe could have happened and nothing else could have happened like that. I'm not making those inferences because I don't think I can make those inferences. I don't think anybody can make those inferences. What I can do is make other inferences which are clear. So one of the ones which is clear is that all the human beings alive today go back to an ancestral couple, right? So that's an inference that I can make. Another inference that I can make is that Islam's view about the purpose of life and the existence of life fundamentally contradicts that which a philosophical naturalist infers from Darwin's theory of saying human existence is purely for survival and reproduction. Those types of things, we can make clear-cut arguments and say, no, that completely contradicts Islam and that doesn't make sense. Other things, I can't make those calls. Those things are actually quite difficult to do.
Thank you. Do you mind if I ask a second question?
Yeah, of course.
On your slide where it showed the bats and the wings and stuff like that,
Yep.
Why didn't you use pictures of the bone structure? I think it shares a lot more similarity compared to this.
Yeah, I can use that.
I'm just saying, fair enough, these animals are very different, but you were suggesting that I don't remember the wording correctly, but you were saying that it's on a surface level, I think, if I remember correctly.
No, what I was trying to get to is that whether you look at a biochemical level, an anatomical level, or a linguistic, or whatever, whatever layer you look at, you have what's known as homoplasy, which is similarities which are not due to common ancestry. So I could have made that into a images which were just bone structures, or I could have made that into DNA sequences. It wouldn't really make a difference. The fundamental point I was trying to get to is that we have what's known as homoplasy, which is similarities at different levels which are not due to common ancestry.
Thank you very much.
I think somebody, was it? I'll go with you because you already asked the question. Yes?
Thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask, do we as Muslims believe that Adam and Eve are actually Homo sapiens? That they could have been Neanderthals, that then from their ancestors come, their offsprings have become Homo sapiens. We don't know for sure that humans were fully evolved as they were created at the start. And I think I wanted to put in from someone who asked the question.
Okay, let me answer that first, then we'll
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in terms of why we weren't fully involved in the start, because if we were fully put into the gods.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
You said humans, why weren't we created fully involved?
Yeah.
So what I was saying was that the idea of fully evolved is based on goals, and that's not the way that evolution works.
Yeah. Although, can you answer the first question?
Okay, so your first question was
Do we know,
about so the thing is, look, we as human beings today, our ancestors going back, we were all, if you want to call us Homo sapiens, going back to Adam and Eve. You can make that. That's not an issue. Now, human beings, our genetic traits and also our anatomical traits, they are affected by where we live, and they're products, not completely, but they are products of geographical distribution. So we have different types of evolution going on in terms of human species all across the world, right? So those things are happening. Now, again, we're getting into those sort of questions which are kind of new, that in the sense that they don't disprove Islam, and it doesn't prove atheism, it doesn't get to the crux of the issue. The crux of the issue is, why would somebody accept the idea which Islam proposes that Adam and Eve existed, which is unscientific, which makes no sense from a methodological naturalistic point of view, or another point, which is that Islam believes that Jesus, he was born to a virgin, which from a scientific perspective is nonsense, doesn't make any sense, or why Muslims believe that Moses struck his staff and the sea parted. Again, from a methodological naturalistic point of view, complete nonsense, doesn't make any sense. And the answer is because we have a belief in God. That if there is no God, then everything has to be explained naturalistically. The virgin birth is impossible, the miracle of Moses is impossible, Adam and Eve is impossible. But if God does exist, then all of those things are possibilities, but then the next question is, how do we know that happened? And for us to make that argument, we need to make an argument for why we believe Islam is true. However, it all goes back to that fundamental point of the existence of God. Because somebody can turn around and say, do you know what? Fair enough, Darwin's theory, it's got these issues. Fair enough, it's been misused. Fair enough, it's got this. But from a methodological, naturalistic point of view, isn't it the best example? Isn't it true that the Islamic narrative has no scientific basis, in the sense that it doesn't fit in methodological naturalism? I'll say yes. Isn't it true that Darwin's mechanism does? Say yes. Okay, so somebody will say, why would you choose one over the other? So I'd make 2 points here. The first point I'd make is there's a false dichotomy, because no one is saying in the scientific community that Darwin's theory is absolutely true and is literally true. So it's a false thing to pit religion versus science. But on a second level, there is a question that they're asking which is different to the first one. And their question is, well, why would you still accept religious miracles as opposed to taking naturalistic understandings of every type of phenomenon, right? And that's where the question really gets down to, well, do you believe in God or not? Because if you believe in God, then those types of things are possible. If you don't, then there has to be a naturalistic understanding. Therefore, when you really get to the crux of the issue, when it comes to Darwinism and Islam, it's not got to do with biology. It's got to do with your first principles, whether you begin off with the existence of God or you deny the existence of God. And that dictates the lenses by which you look at the rest of the data.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I'm more focused about the origin of us as humans. And I think someone else has said about theistic evolution.
Yep.
Said you do not accept this as a concept. I still don't understand why both science and Islam can coexist.
Again, for someone to say that they can't coexist assumes that there's a contradiction. Yeah? Now, the contradiction is not that there's something in Islam and there's something in science and they contradict. That's another separate discussion. The real issue is that there's those people who are saying science is giving us facts. They're giving us things which are absolutely true, right? And then religion's making these claims, right? So therefore, they're both going to contradict each other. What I'm doing here is I'm saying the ones who are making this claim, they're giving you a popular understanding of science, which is not the academic understanding. Because even if you do not believe in God, the idea that these scientific theories, which are pushed out as facts, you can challenge those using just the philosophy of science. You don't even have to have a religious conviction to say, look, we're not going to accept this theory to be literally true. Right? We just accept it to be a working model. The false dichotomy is that the narrative which is given is, look, science has given us facts and religion has given us fiction, so therefore we should choose facts and fictions. And I'm challenging, I'm not answering the question. It's like someone asks you, when did you stop being your wife? Yeah? No matter which way you answer it, you're done for. So you can't answer the question, you have to challenge the question. So that's what I'm doing here. When there's a science, but science is against Islam, right? Someone says, why would you choose fictitious religion over factual science? I'm not going to answer the question, I'm going to challenge the question first. And I think this is very important because fundamentally I believe there's different levels of misunderstandings between the public and the academic side of things. So for example, science is seen as a process or a methodology which would lead people away from God, right? However, historically it's the other way around. Because the modern scientific method, which doesn't go back to Galileo or Newton, it actually goes back to Hassan ibn Haytham 1,000 years ago, who was a Quranic scholar. The very scientific methodology that he devised, which we use up to this day, which was very different to the proto-science that the Greeks were doing before him, he said, I am doing science because I want to become closer to God. Because he saw that science was trying to discover the how, and he was trying, and Islam gives you the why. These are two different things which don't contradict each other, the how and the why. So the fundamental issues here are not fundamentally to do with dates or times or how you define Homo sapiens or how you do this. It's fundamentally to do with whether we believe in God or not, or and how that paints the way that we look at the rest of the data. Because it's about lenses. If you have blue lenses on, you're just going to see blue. If you have red lenses on, you're just going to see red. But if you take them off, you're going to see all different types of things.
I guess what I was trying to get at is we can't use science as the how to explain what happened during this, with what we really understand.
We can use it as an attempt of how, but remember that how isn't written in stone. Yeah. Yes.
So Karl Popper, in his book Logical Scientific Discovery, he said that the demarcation between science and pseudoscience is falsification. So what's interesting with what you said is that Darwinism is a valid theory within the scientific framework. So what is the method by which it allows for falsification?
Okay, so that's a really good question. The issue with that is that falsification, which was a very popular view in science, in philosophy of science, has now been superseded. So now, although even at a popular level we do speak about falsification, the view that's held by philosophers in general now is scientific holism, which is that scientific theories have to make sense within a sort of system. Even if something's technically falsified, it doesn't mean it's wrong. That's the new view that they have. So even if I was to answer the question, it would be kind of redundant, because there are ways that you can always change your assumption and resurrect a dead theory. So as an example, if we were living in a Popperian time, when Popper's view was popular, we would say Darwin was very clear in The Origin of Species that gradualism is a fundamental assumption of his theory. In fact, T.H. Huxley tried to persuade him to take out gradualism, and he said, no, my theory is not going to work without gradualism. So he made it clear gradualism is an assumption in my theory. Gradualism has largely been admitted that this is false in the way that, we have punctuated equilibrium. We have we don't have the story that we believed in terms of steady and slow evolution. However, someone can turn around and say, well, therefore Darwin's wrong, therefore we can throw it out. That might have been possible in Popper's time, but now because we believe in scientific holism, we can replace the assumption of gradualism, which Darwin had, with another assumption of, say, punctuated equilibrium or whatever. So you can technically resurrect dead theories even if there's direct falsifiable evidence that you've discovered.
No.
Yes?
But isn't then the problem that you have scientific holism, that the lines become very blurry, that there is no science or pseudoscience, that it's just...
Yeah, the demarcation problem is a huge problem. It's not been resolved. And this is a big, big issue, you're right. And this is very problematic. Yes?
So, I was going to point out, you did mention it briefly that we're here talking about Islam and Darwinism, but not Islam and Einsteinism or, quantum theory, which also got its own problem, the interpretation problem and so forth from Schrödinger and so forth. But does it can you expand on that, why this is a thing? Is it because talking about human precisely, and the other is just talking about atoms and fundamental matters?
So that's fundamentally because if I was to, say, meet a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, and I was an atheist, and I challenged their Genesis story, right? There would be a defensive mechanism automatically, right? It's the same thing. So if you flip the script, from an atheistic perspective, this is the Genesis story, from a materialistic point of view. And if there's these problems and these issues and these assumptions and what's going on, then if you're trying to project the idea that atheism is true and our Genesis story is also true, then when these things come up, there's obviously going to be a lot of defense mechanisms coming up, and there's going to be a lot of claims made which can't be substantiated using the evidence, and that's basically what's going on. It is biology is not supposed to be a battlefield between theists and deists and atheists. It's not, but it's become like that within this field. So that's basically in a nutshell the answer. And like I recommended, Darwinism as a Religion is a really good book too.
So mainly because the Genesis thing, and
because it's theologically, it makes, if God doesn't exist, then something like this has to be true by necessity, right? So there's a emotional psychodynamic investment in this being true from an atheistic perspective.
However, you did then say actually Darwinism doesn't prove the existence or not existence of God.
Yeah. And see, that's the point which I really want to emphasize. So if I had 1 minute to give a presentation on Darwin's theory, the only slide I would bring up is, that's the only one I'd bring up. And I would summarize to say, this is what Julian Huxley says, this is what Richard Dawkins says, this is what Michael Roos says, and Darwin would have completely disagreed that his theory disproves the existence of God. Everything else for me is fodder. Everything else for me is just not that important. Because that's why we're discussing this topic. That's why we're not speaking about Islam, string theory, and atheism. Yes?
So for atheists and agnostics, science is very appealing because it's based on empirical evidence.
Yeah.
So as a Muslim, what, other than the beliefs and the Muslim community and the beliefs that they hold around hadith, what's the empirical evidence that your religion exists? And secondly, you say that if
Can I answer the first?
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. So the first point is that there isn't an issue with accepting empirical data, whether you're a theist or an atheist. What's more likely to lead somebody to become an atheist is if they turn away from purely a scientific appreciation to something which is more like scientism. And I think that's where the issue is. So science, valuing science and the contributions of science and using science, that's not an issue when it comes to Islam, because Muslims are the ones who came up with the scientific method, so that's not a problem. The issue is scientism, and scientism is the idea that, one, science is the primary way of knowing the world, and two, that scientific conclusions are seen as being true literally. Now, the second one we dealt with in the lecture. The first one we didn't deal with, but we can deal with that whether we commit to a religion or we don't commit to a religion. Science is not the only way of gaining knowledge about the world. Science is not the yardstick by which we measure truth, we discover truth. So this is where we have to break down the difference between scientism and science. Now, I've heard people myself say, I believe in science. And it's supposed to be almost a subtle way of saying I'm an atheist. And they say, I believe in science. But the problem is that what they've done is they've taken science and they've made it into a worldview. Now, if we say, look, I'm only going to believe in things which are scientific, what you have to do is, you have to look at that claim, because science is based upon mathematics and logic. Mathematics and logic cannot be proven scientifically, but science is based upon them. So if someone says, I believe in science, well, you can't prove mathematics and logic. What's your name? Shruti, right? So if I was to bring you up here and in front of the class, and I was to bring some sort of machine, and it's a belief machine, and it brings up all of your beliefs on this board, right? Your beliefs which are deemed rational. You believe Madagascar exists. You believe you had a great grandmother. You believe feeding orphans is good. And we took out your beliefs, and your beliefs were there. 99% of your beliefs could not be scientifically verified. They could not. So you believe in Madagascar existing, right? That's based on testimony, right? It's not scientific data. You've heard of Madagascar. You've seen people who say they're from Madagascar. You haven't been there yourself. It's not empirical data. Your belief in feeding orphans. That belief from a purely scientific point of view, if I was to take a microscope, telescope, whatever, and if you're to look at a situation in which you would infer some moral imperative, we gotta help that person, scientifically, there's nothing there. Science has nothing to say about the existence of morals, right? Now, if we were to do that with your brain, 99% of the beliefs that you hold to be rational and dear are not scientifically verified. Then that gives you an idea that it's not just, science is not the only way of getting to truth, right? Now, we as Muslims, and you don't have to be a Muslim to realize this, there's a whole bunch of ways that human beings can arrive at truth. Science is one. Science is an attempt that you can try and reach out. There's reason, there's introspection. A lot of the moral imperatives or moral feelings that we have, there is no scientific basis for them at all. So when you break down these things, there's many different ways of knowing. There is one difference if we're to make a list between someone who's agnostic and an atheist and someone who's a Muslim. And they're to list down the things of how they gain knowledge. Testimony, empiricism, reason, logic, maths, whatever, introspection. There's only one difference between the two. And that difference is, as Muslims, we do believe in something known as the fitrah. The fitrah is a natural state that a human being is born in. A natural state. And this natural state is awoken, and this is the natural state that has spiritual experiences. Apart from that, both lists would be identical, but we would have that extra component. But other than that, I believe anybody who uses their mind and tries to reason will realize a purely scientism type of perspective on knowledge doesn't hold.
But then,
doesn't make sense.
Why? Okay, fine. If all Muslims have that introspection like that, or they're born with this idea.
No, we believe all human beings are, not only Muslims. We believe all human beings. No,
fine.
Muslims admit that this thing exists.
Right, but then why, within the Muslim community, is there so much conflicting? Like, do they have so many conflicting morals? Like, one Muslim will believe one thing, and another Muslim will believe another, but they're both practicing Muslims.
Yeah.
So where does that disparity come from?
So the thing is, as Muslims, we would have a moral code, a moral imperative, but within that you can have a scope for differences, right? So we do have this even in the world today. You may have two people who, even from an atheistic perspective, they both subscribe to consequentialism as a thing, but they can have differences within that. So we can have differences too.
So if you have differences within that, how do you know what's the truth?
They can both be true.
So then there's not one truth, there's multiple truths.
No. Look, here's the Islamic dynamic on this, right? When you have a judge, and a judge makes a decision which happens to be based on a moral imperative, but it happens to be wrong, or it happens to be not the most just. As Muslims, we believe that that person is upon the truth and they're rewarded for that. But if he makes another decision, but this time he's right, and he's also, he's used all of his capacity to come to the right decision, he will get double the reward for that. So we don't believe truth is plural or truth is relative or all the rest, but we believe human beings do what they can according to their capacity. So you have people who, they base their lives on, say, helping orphans, and you have other people who base their lives on trying to help widows. Now we don't say it's one way or the other way. Human beings are built in different ways, right? And it's just like, I'm trying to remember a verse of the Quran, but the meaning of that verse of the Quran is everyone works according to the way that they've been. I'm trying to remember that word. Yes. What's the translation of that?
Everybody works his way.
In his way. Every person works in like their unique way, right? So that's how I'll answer that.
I'm sorry, just really quickly.
Yeah.
If you say that if like science doesn't exist, if God doesn't exist, then it's necessary to believe in science. And
No, not necessary to believe in science. Necessary to believe
in something like
in something like Darwin.
Darwinism, right?
Yeah.
And you say that like science is based on maths and logic. We don't understand that fully, and like we don't have any like empirical evidence for the answers to logic and maths and whatever. Why can it not just be that we just don't have the answers? Does that have to then lead to God? Like, why can it just be that?
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. You can't make the jump from, well, we don't know, therefore God. I agree with that. But that's not something I believe in. So we can't prove mathematics using empiricism ever. Doesn't even make any sense, right? And even the statement, science is the only way of looking at the world, we can't even prove that statement scientifically. You're absolutely right that if somebody used to say, look, there's all this confusion, we're not really sure about this, so might as well turn to religion or God. That doesn't make any sense. But I wouldn't make that argument. I would make a separate argument, right? And this lecture isn't about why Islam is true or why I believe Islam is true. But I would say, if somebody used to come up to me and say to me, so why are you Muslim and not Hindu or atheist or something like this? And I would say that it's because of my conviction that Islam has a pure monotheistic understanding which awakens the natural way the human beings are built, right? Now someone's going to say, well, that sounds very airy-fairy and I can't really put that in a test tube, I can't really put that in a philosophy paper. I'd say, well, yeah, I agree with you, you can't. But that's the answer I would give.
Thank you.
Yes?
I'll ask you about Darwinism. How do they look at topics like beauty and patterns and variety in animals? Why are not like the one type of way or one color or one stuff like that?
Well, there's two different things here. The first thing is that the environment's different. So you're going to have different colors, different shapes, different forms.
Or the patterns and symmetry.
Same. You'd have different things, right? But in terms of beauty, aesthetics, and these types of things, fundamentally, and this is why the atheist worldview for me doesn't make any sense. Fundamentally, love, hate, passion, morals, civilization, ethics, all of these things you essentially break down to a byproduct of the selfish need. And that for me makes no sense. Right? You can come up to me and say to me, all the biologists are in agreement that human morality can be broken down to chemicals and all these types of things and a byproduct of a survival mechanism. I'll say that's bullcrap. Right? No, I don't accept that. So for me, there are things that we a priori, even before looking at evidence, know whether this thing makes sense or not. Someone can give you a naturalistic explanation, But that explanation is not really giving you an explanation, it's explaining it away. So when you have, say, Darwinists who say, we've worked out morality, here's a history of how it works, right? We first were selfish, and then we needed to be good to our kin, and then over time natural selection made us forget that we were supposed to be good to our kin and gave us a shortcut, which is be good to those around you, and eventually you have this moral circle which increased, Peter Singer, with the expanding moral circle, right? I would say that's total crap. That's not explaining morality. That's explaining morality away. That's reducing is reducing it to something absurd, right? So we as human beings don't have to be held hostage to a purely materialistic, scientific, reductive understanding. And that's just something which generally isn't challenged, but it should be challenged. The idea that human beings can be broken down and analyzed, and everything has to be explained scientifically.